So yeah, that's right. Today I'm going to talk through some of my research, which has been looking at, I've been looking at late Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic lithic scatters in quite a large portion of Eastern England, but today I'm concentrating solely on the Mesolithic material. My PhD grew out of a collaborative PhD project set up by English Heritage, now Historic England, and the University of Manchester. And the idea really was to try and assess the potential of evidence from lithic scatters from disturbed contexts such as plough zones and other disturbed contexts like that. And in a region where perhaps there hasn't been that much concerted research into the Mesolithic, which is actually most of lowland Britain really, apart from a few hotspots, as we'll see. A lot of my work's been dealing with methodological issues about how to sample scatters and things like that, but today I really would just like to give quite a superficial really, but an overview of the regional data set that my work's collated and what I think is the potential and importance of doing that kind of work maybe in other parts of the country as well. So the Mesolithic doesn't need much introduction. Broadly speaking, it's a long period, 5,000 years between around 9,000 and 4,000 BC. And this is the early part of the Holocene when we're seeing the recolonisation of Britain by woodland environments. And at the beginning of the period, we're still connected to the continent with Brexit, the original Brexit coming in about 7,500 BC. The Mesolithic is synonymous with distinctive flint working techniques, and in particular the production of little microliths, which we interpret as inserts into composite tools, hunting equipment and such like, and of course these hunter-gatherers who are subsisting on a wide range of wild resources, wild plant resources and animal resources. So in the last 10 years or so, the Mesolithic's actually begun to see a good deal more academic attention than it has done for a long time, but it's still probably fair to say that it's the most neglected period in British prehistory. And this has a lot of implications for anyone who's interested in the period, two of which are of particular relevance to me today, I suppose. One that is most of our understanding of the period comes from very few sites, and one thinks immediately of places like Starcar and Thatcher. And I've just put some pictures of these kind of sites up here. There's Starcar up there and Thatcham's up here. And one of the problems with that is that these sites are always in very specific locations. They're generally wetland sites where the preservation of the material is good enough that we get faunal remains and in situ lithic scatters and environmental remains and things like that. This means that we actually have pretty poor understanding of what's going on in the rest of the landscape, and also it means that if your region doesn't have some of these flagship type sites or they haven't been investigated, whole regions of the country really don't have much of a Mesolithic record that we know about. The material's there, but there's been very little synthesis or looking at it. This has obvious implications for development-led archaeology or amateur groups undertaking work in different parts of the country, which means it's very hard for them to put any Mesolithic sites into any sort of context or to realise the potential of any that they might encounter during fieldwork. And it's those concerns that have led to at least some of the research I've been doing. So yeah, very briefly, this is my study area. You can see it there in terms of Northwest Europe. It's been defined purely on the basis of county boundaries or district authority boundaries, just because of pragmatics, to make it easy for my data collection essentially. But as you can see, it takes in a big part of East Anglia and then Bedfordshire, mainly so that I get the full stretch of the Great Ouse Valley going into the Fens. It's an area that many of you will probably be familiar with. And if we just have a quick look at the geology and the land use, it's famously subdued topographically. The geology is dominated by, well, the upland geologies in the eastern part and to some extent in the western part are dominated by glacial tills or boulder clays up on the interflues between the valleys, with areas of lighter soils on river terraces or on glacial outwash, which is, you can see the pinks and the oranges, and especially in the Breckland where there's cover sands here, and light soils on sandstones and chalk going up in narrow bands through the country, through the area. Probably the most important thing to take away from here is the large deposits which have accumulated in areas of former wetland, so peats and silts, most notably in the Fens, but also in the Norfolk Broads and in some of the drowned estuaries on the Suffolk coast. And it's important to note that most of these deposits were emplaced after the Mesolithic. So they're effectively sealing Mesolithic landscapes underneath them. And if we just quickly look at the land use, just to emphasise that this is one of the most intensively farmed areas of the country, and this has obvious implications for the context from which we would expect our lithic scatters to come from. So brown here is arable agriculture, and the only exceptions really are urban areas and some forestry plantations, notably in the Breckland there. So, like I said, this isn't a region that's particularly well, it's rich in Mesolithic and late Upper Paleolithic sites, but it's not particularly well known. These are some of the sites that would be familiar to period specialists or to other archaeologists. It's very notable that almost all of the Mesolithic sites result from work carried out in the early 20th century when the Prehistoric Society of East Anglia was active, and in that kind of era of the great collectors. One thing that the area is quite rich in is PaleoEnvironmental data. So there's a number of quite important and detailed pollen sequences which chart the development of these woodland environments and things, and they are quite useful for giving some context to the data we've got from lithic scatters. So it should be emphasised that lithic scatters form almost the entirety of the evidence for the Mesolithic in this area. There are no substantial faunal assemblages, and there are very few associated radiocarbon data or anything like that. So a big part of my research has basically been trying to amass as much data as possible on lithic scatters. It should be emphasised how little of this material is out there in publication. So it's been based really around the historic environment records, literature searches, going through the archives of individuals. Some of the most important individuals who've been associated with the area as shown here have made big contributions, and going back to older collections and looking at them afresh. So I've tried to be as comprehensive as I can, but I've also been quite strict on what I will allow in. So if there's any ambiguity about data or what have you, then I haven't included them. But you can see here that I've got around 1,200 records of Mesolithic lithic scatters. I've separated them into fine spots and collections. Collections being material which is poorly provenanced, so it might only come from you might only know it's come from a certain parish, whereas fine spots are more accurately located. It's important to note that this is a threefold or fourfold increase on the number of sites that were recorded in the late 1970s when the CBA made their national gazetteer of Mesolithic sites, and they are increasing all the time. My database is no doubt already out of date, mainly as a result of development-led archaeology and amateur field working, metal detecting, amateur field walking groups, all those kind of groups. And very quickly, just to emphasise here, the character of these lithic scatter sites, the vast majority of them are very small, single finds or assemblages of under 50 pieces, with far fewer larger assemblages. And then the context, of course, the vast majority from a known context come from the plough soil, very few from in situ soil profiles, buried soils or features, things like that, and a large where we just don't know the context, but we assume that they're coming from disturbed context, really, plough soil. So this is the overall distribution of Mesolithic sites. I've just shaded in the parishes where there are collections of Mesolithic material, where we don't really know exactly where they come from, and there are the fine spots, the little dots. You should be able to make out the little dots are single finds, and the larger dots are more substantial assemblages. There are some clear patterns here. Some of this results from biases in fieldwork and such like. So you can see massive concentration on the southeast fen edge here, and in the Breckland, mainly resulting from older collections in the 20th century. You could say the same about the area around Norwich. I haven't got time to go into all of the biasing factors, but obviously they're really important and something that I've dealt with quite a lot. More generally, though, you can see, I hope you can see, that there's quite a sort of riverine distribution to these Mesolithic sites. You can see strings of sites strung out along river valleys down here, the river valleys of the Breckland, or strung out along the course of the Great Ouse, or the Flit down here, the Gipping, and round the confluence of the Yare and the Tass, and so on and so on. And this is to be expected. This conforms to our models of Mesolithic settlement, highly based around the river valleys with less exploitation of what we might call the upland areas, especially here where they're dominated by clay-based soils. And some of the most interesting patterns in this distribution really come out when you look at the surface geology of these finds. And we can, from this, I hope this shows quite clearly really that these areas of boulder clay, glacial till, Mesolithic find spots here are massively underrepresented compared to the area that they take up, and in parallel, Mesolithic find spots are very well represented on the lighter soils, on certain areas of the cover sand, particularly on these sandstones that you can see threading their way up here, which is the turquoise colour, and also on river terraces and on glacial outwash. This again conforms to models which have been going on for ages. People have been talking about this kind of link between light soils where ecological conditions might be more favourable to hunting or settlement and things like that, and avoidance of the heavier clay soils. But this is only partly true, because obviously we can see that activity is extending over all of the substrates of the area, as we'll see in a bit more detail. So moving away maybe from this really big regional scale, just to look at the landscape scale of these lithic scatters. So the most important complexes of sites really do come in these riverine locations in the river valleys. And here's an example from the lower Cam Valley, just north of Cambridge. And we can see a string of lithic scatters. All of these are dominated by Mesolithic material, strung out along the floodplain of the River Cam there, and along little tributaries as well. And these sites are semi-continuous, really, and strung out for maybe 3 or 4 kilometres along the edge of the floodplain here. And we could multiply examples of this. I haven't got a slide, but the Lower Ouse Valley, where Chris Evans has been excavating for so many years, provides a really good example. And here again in Suffolk, the Lower Lark Valley, we can see these sites strung out along the edge of the floodplain of the River Lark and on the tributaries, and very little material is being recovered away from these highly specific locations. The other thing to say is that these sites are clearly made up of palimpsests of centuries, if not millennia, of occupation, and you can see this very clearly in the typology of the microliths from these sites, and they also reflect a very wide range of activities. So we're getting all sorts of different tool types. Very hard to disentangle them, but it's clear that these are very persistently occupied places. The most informative of these riverine sites, as I'm calling them, remains Peacock's Farm in Cambridgeshire, within my study area. First investigated in the 30s by Clark and Harry Godwin, and in some ways very similar to the examples you've seen before, with extensive lithic scatters along these sand ridges adjacent to the old course of the Little Ouse, and a similar range of microliths from early forms right through to late Mesolithic geometric forms. But here, importantly, there was an environmental sequence that was sampled, and this very clearly showed that there was a reduction in woodland cover associated with the Mesolithic occupation, and there's suggestions that they might be burning the vegetation. And this seems to have been carrying on for some thousands of years. So again, we have this persistent riverside locales being used, being persistently revisited. So far, this fits in very well with how we understand, really, the Mesolithic landscapes of lowland Britain more generally. But if we move away outside of the river valleys, one of the surprises for me, really, going through this database, has been the discovery of often quite extensive sites in areas where you might not expect them. Much rarer, but such as here at Bannon, this is South Norfolk, up on the Boulder Clay Plateau, well out of the river valleys, in a watershed location, really. These rivers flowing off into the Breckland and the Fen, and these going down to the Waveney. And in this watershed location, we've got this very extensive lithic scatter, dominated by Mesolithic material. Over 100 trancheaxes have been recovered from this site by the landowner over many, many years. It's probably the most axes from any site in southern Britain, maybe with one exception. And there are hints from the composition of the toolkit that different activities might be going on here, such as more heavy-duty woodworking or task-based activities. But I'm also taken by this very specific location, and I'm tempted to think of this as a location where people from the different river valley systems can come together, or that is accessible by different communities living in these different valley systems. That's highly speculative, obviously. And there's other examples. So Great Melton, quite a well-known site, again on this upland plateau just near to the confluence of the Yare and the Tass near Norwich. Or here, a concentration of stray finds and lithic assemblages from Mendlesham in Suffolk, again in this watershed location up on the heavy soils which traditionally have been seen as not being exploited during the Mesolithic. And a final example of activity away from the riverine centres, as you might call it, is at Hockham Mere. And there are other examples of occupation occurring around these lakes in South Norfolk and North Suffolk, such as Langmere. But here at Hockham we've got extensive lithic scatters around the old lake shore, and the environmental sequence from Hockham contains abundant microcharcoal, which is restricted to the Mesolithic horizons of the sequence, and seems to indicate either extensive settlement with campfires nearby, or perhaps more probably burning off of reed vegetation and manipulating the environment. So we might be seeing similar activities to some extent carrying on in some of these upland locations as we saw in the riverine sites. So obviously I've been dealing with a very broad canvas looking at the entire Mesolithic period, which is over 5,000 years. And just to introduce a little bit of chronology to this, I've given it here. This shows a very simplified breakdown into what we might call early and late Mesolithic sites. This is highly simplified in itself. So we have an early Mesolithic extending from, say, 9,000 BC through to around 7,000, maybe a bit later, and a later Mesolithic going down to 4,000 BC, defined by different types of microlith forms. And we can see that the distributions aren't so terribly different, really. And indeed, at many sites, we do have evidence for both periods being represented, so they're obviously palimpsests. If anything, the later Mesolithic seems to see a little bit of a reduction in activity away from the kind of upland sites, as I've described them, into those more classic riverine locations, but that pattern's by no means clear-cut. But one of the most interesting things here, which goes against what's been written about the period in this area before, is that the number of early sites seems to be much greater than late ones. And this, you can see this whether you look at the total number of classified microliths or whether you look at the total number of find spots from which these microlith forms have been found. And this has been observed in other parts of the country before, notably by Roger Jacobi, who spoke about how maybe in the late Mesolithic, with the rise of very dense deciduous woodland, which is quite resource poor, we might see a decline in population or a decline in activity. And more recently and more fashionably, people have started to maybe link it to this to a downturn in climatic conditions at about 8.2 thousand years ago, here, registered in the Greenland ice cores here. And that's become quite a hot topic. And these are, quite tempting interpretations in some way, but there are reasons to be quite cautious about this, I think. Certainly my work suggests that. And it might be that we're seeing here really a case of reduced archaeological visibility. This was quite clearly demonstrated, I think, from some work we did on a plough zone lithic scatter, again in Cambridgeshire here. Field walking of the site recovered quite a large assemblage of about 1,000 Mesolithic flints, and the microlith component was a mixture of early and late forms, approximately equally. So I was quite happy to interpret it as seeing both those periods. But when you went back and you excavated and you sieved carefully, what you found is that undoubtedly the little geometric microlith forms that typify the late Mesolithic are much, much harder to recover. And when we looked through the assemblage we got from excavation, it was clear that the early forms were very rare and the assemblage was massively dominated by late Mesolithic material. And this is a real problem in that we simply, with the methodologies we use, we might just simply not be giving the late Mesolithic much of a chance to be recognised. There's also a bit of a trend, and I've just highlighted two sites, recently excavated sites, where we started to find this, where there's evidence for late Mesolithic activity on the floodplains of the major rivers, but sealed by alluvium. And often you get early Mesolithic activity down there as well, but there seems to be a really strong pattern for quite extensive late Mesolithic sites. So here, this is at Manor Farm, Melton, Keynes on the Grey Twos, and further downstream on the Melton, on the Grey Twos at Willington in Bedfordshire, both excavations recently by the Cambridge Archaeological Unit. And underneath the alluvium, we're finding these dense late Mesolithic scatters with no early Mesolithic material. And if there is a genuine trend, which was suggested by the broader scale distribution towards these floodplain locations, it's going to be a lot more difficult for us to prospect for these sites. So that just gives hopefully a little bit of chronology to it. The picture that emerges for me from some of the work I've done at least is how abundant the evidence for Mesolithic activity in this area is. And this isn't an area that's been intensively studied or is thought of being a particularly core area. And and the kind of work that I've done in assembling data here could be replicated all over the country, and arguably really needs to be done to inform future work that's been going on in developer-led work and in amateur work, and to raise the profile of the period throughout the country rather than just at those flagship sites that I spoke about earlier. But we're a long way from being able to make convincing interpretations about landscape inhabitation in this period. At the moment, there's a picture emerging really of these persistently occupied landscape-scale complexes of sites. But unpicking them requires long-term and very detailed methodologies to be rolled out. And I think probably the best scenario is that that's going to take place in the developer-led context. And we're starting to see that emerge in Eastern England at any rate, and elsewhere in the country. So I think that's all I've got to say. Thank you.